making some changes, some adjustments, in the hopes of furthering narrowing the differences and getting closer to something that both Ukraine and obviously the United States are very comfortable with. Obviously, this will ultimately have to be signed off by our presidents, although I feel very comfortable about that happening, given the progress we've made. And then obviously there's the Russian side of the equation. But again, we think we have some pretty substantial insights over the last 9 months into some of the things that are really important to them. So I think the takeaway from it is, I think this is a very, very meaningful, I would say, probably best meeting and day we've had so far in this entire process, going back to when we first came into office in January.
The Ukraine war with Russia should have never happened. If I were president, it never would have happened. We're trying to get it ended. One way or the other, we have to get it ended. So
new tensions surfaced today after President Donald Trump delivered one of his sharpest public criticisms, yet toward Ukraine's leadership, accusing them of showing zero gratitude to the United States, at a moment when Washington is heavily invested in building what could become the first real path toward ending the conflict. His remark, blunt and deliberate, arrived at a time when U.S. officials are working intensely behind the scenes to assemble a workable peace framework, one involving security guarantees, territorial considerations, long-term oversight mechanisms, and a complex set of diplomatic commitments that span multiple governments. Trump's statement cut through the usual cautious language surrounding the negotiations, exposing the frustration that has been building in Washington as deadlines approach and cooperation remains uneven. With delegations preparing for critical discussions in Geneva, the mood among negotiators is tense. American planners have been attempting to maintain a disciplined diplomatic posture, balancing the pressure to deliver results with the realities of dealing with two nations, locked into deeply conflicting positions. The U.S. proposal, which outlined structural elements for a cessation of hostilities and potential security arrangements, was intended to be a starting point, a framework that Ukraine, Russia, and European partners could adjust through negotiation. Instead, the proposal has become a focal point for disagreements, objections, and competing expectations. When Trump said Ukraine has shown zero gratitude, it amplified a feeling among U.S. policymakers that Kyiv is pushing back without acknowledging the scale of American support that has sustained them throughout the conflict. That criticism doesn't exist in isolation. It reflects a broader shift happening within Washington, where political patience is thinning as the conflict drags on and international pressure grows for measurable progress. Officials have acknowledged privately that multiple components of the peace outline have been met with resistance. Ukraine disputes several structural elements. European governments are drafting modifications to protect their own security concerns, and analysts are warning that continued delays could weaken the diplomatic leverage currently available. Trump's comments underscore that the United States expects cooperation, not endless revisions or strategic hesitation, especially at a time when momentum toward negotiation is fragile and dependent on coordinated effort. The phrase zero gratitude echoed across diplomatic circles today because of what it reveals about the psychological landscape behind the negotiation process. For months, U.S. agencies have been coordinating intelligence assessments, monitoring troop movements, evaluating economic pressure points, and working with European partners to shape a shared position. When Ukraine challenges parts of the plan publicly, it has ripple effects. It complicates the internal cohesion of the Western coalition, signals disunity to Moscow at a sensitive moment, and increases skepticism among political figures in Washington who are already questioning how long the U.S. can sustain the current level of involvement. Trump's remarks highlight an underlying concern that Washington is carrying the heaviest load while others hesitate to compromise. Inside briefings, officials have repeatedly warned that the window for a negotiated settlement remains narrow and unpredictable. Each party in this conflict views the stakes differently. The United States wants to stabilize the region, prevent further escalation, and avoid a drawn-out confrontation that drains resources and creates long-term strategic vulnerabilities. Ukraine is fighting for territorial integrity and political survival, conditions that make even minor concessions feel existential. Russia, meanwhile, has signaled selective openness to certain points in the U.S. framework, though its long-term intentions remain unclear and often contradictory. In this atmosphere of mismatched motivations, frustration is almost inevitable, but Trump's language today shows that the U.S. is no longer willing to mask that frustration behind diplomatic vocabulary. The situation becomes even more complicated when factoring in Europe's shifting stance. European governments have drafted proposed changes to the U.S. plan, including adjustments to military caps and security arrangements. They are racing against the clock to present a united response before discussions advance further. Their edits reflect their own risk calculations, the fear that a premature or imbalanced agreement could leave them exposed to future instability along the continent's eastern flank. This additional layer of negotiation adds time, pressure, and uncertainty to an already strained process. As of today, the effort to shape a peace pathway stands at a sensitive crossroads. Multiple governments are navigating a maze of political pressures, public expectations, and strategic red lines. Trump's zero-gratitude comment may appear blunt, but it exposes the underlying tension inside the U.S. position, the belief that Washington is taking enormous diplomatic, political, and economic risks to create the conditions for peace, and that progress from others has not matched that level of commitment. Whether this intensifies cooperation or deepens existing divides remains to be seen, but it undeniably marks a significant shift in tone at a critical moment in the negotiations. Inside diplomatic circles, today brought a new wave of assessments from U.S. and European officials who have been tracking the increasingly fragile state of coordination surrounding the peace framework. Several internal briefings show that concerns are mounting over the widening gap between the expectations of Washington and the political signals emerging out of Kyiv. Analysts reviewing the developments note that the U.S. has invested months of strategic labor, intelligence coordination, and international pressure to prepare this framework, and yet the conversations with Ukraine continue to reveal hesitation, distrust, and a reluctance to agree to certain foundational steps. These complications are not unexpected, but the timing and intensity of the disagreements have raised questions about how committed the parties truly are to shaping a realistic pathway toward stability. Officials monitoring the situation have noted that while Ukraine's objections stem from legitimate national concerns, the manner in which they are being expressed publicly, forcefully, and with direct criticism of key components has complicated Washington's ability to maintain unity among its partners. The United States has long understood that any peace framework must address the fears and security needs of Kyiv, but it also recognizes that negotiations require compromise, recalibration, and strategic flexibility. Trump's remarks yesterday placed these tensions into sharper focus, underscoring Washington's perspective that gratitude is not the issue, it is cooperation, timing, and the willingness to navigate difficult political terrain that matter most at this stage. European diplomats have echoed many of the U.S. concerns, noting that they too are maneuvering through competing pressures as they attempt to finalize their own amendments to the proposal. Their fear is that a fractured approach could weaken the overall negotiating position and inadvertently increase Moscow's leverage. The European modifications that surfaced this week, revisions involving military force levels, territorial recognition mechanisms, and security guarantees, are intended to balance their own security needs with the demands of the negotiating environment. Yet these revisions add another layer of negotiation to a process already strained by competing visions of what a stable, long-term outcome should look like. Behind closed doors, intelligence assessments have pointed to increasing activity along certain frontline sectors, a development that has caused unease among U.S. defense analysts. The timing is significant. Increased battlefield movement, even if limited or defensive, can influence negotiation positions and alter the psychology of diplomatic talks. These shifts often generate fears that one side may attempt to strengthen its bargaining position through tactical maneuvers rather than through concessions and dialogue. For Washington, the goal has been to reduce unpredictability and maintain conditions conducive to meaningful negotiation. Yet the constant interplay between military and diplomatic developments makes the situation far more volatile than most public statements reveal. At the same time, Russia has shown a blend of cautious interest and strategic ambiguity. Moscow's public responses have been deliberately measured, signaling selective openness to certain elements of the framework while avoiding clear commitments to others. This approach has been a hallmark of Russia's negotiation strategy for years. Create pathways for dialogue while avoiding definitive positions that limit future maneuvering. U.S. analysts warn that this ambiguity is not an accident. It is part of a broader effort to maintain leverage until the exact shape of the agreement and the political alignment of its signatories becomes clearer. This uncertainty forces Washington to prepare for multiple possible outcomes, complicating its attempt to move the process forward with confidence. Humanitarian organizations monitoring communities near the conflict zone have reported a new wave of civilian strain, where shortages in energy, medical support, and basic services are becoming more pronounced as winter approaches. These reports carry enormous weight in Washington because worsening humanitarian conditions have historically been used by various actors to shape narratives, justify urgent demands, or exert pressure on international partners. The U.S. understands that any escalation in humanitarian distress can quickly shift political priorities, influence public support, and reshape negotiation lines. As a result, the updated peace efforts are being evaluated, not just through a strategic lens but also through a humanitarian one, recognizing that any sustainable peace must address the immediate realities faced by civilians. The deeper issue emerging from today's developments is the widening perception gap between capitals. Washington sees itself as pushing to end a conflict that has drawn enormous global attention and consumed immense diplomatic resources. Kyiv sees an existential fight where misplaced trust or premature concessions could weaken its long-term sovereignty. Europe sees a delicate security environment where a miscalculated agreement could undermine decades of stability. Russia sees an opportunity to negotiate from a position it believes is stronger than its public messaging suggests. These competing realities make the diplomatic space increasingly narrow, and today's tensions illustrate just how difficult it is to align these divergent perspectives into a single coherent agreement. As the hours pass, negotiators continue testing the limits of each position, searching for common ground in an environment where every word, every concession, and every strategic signal carries weight. The process is slow, methodical, and susceptible to disruption, but it reflects the complexity of ending a conflict that has reshaped global politics and continues to redraw the boundaries of international power. The diplomatic environment grew even more complex today, as new assessments from U.S. and European intelligence services revealed a widening array of geopolitical pressures surrounding the peace effort. These assessments highlight emerging concerns about external actors, states, and non-state networks that are quietly shaping the conditions around the negotiation landscape. Several reports indicate that channels traditionally monitored for influence activity have become increasingly active, suggesting that multiple parties outside the court trio of Washington, Kyiv, and Moscow are seeking to shape outcomes behind the scenes. This added layer of involvement introduces new uncertainties into a process already strained by incompatible expectations and escalating political sensitivities. Officials familiar with the latest intelligence briefings noted that foreign influence networks are using diplomatic backchannels, economic leverage, and targeted media operations to insert themselves into the conversation. While these actors do not control the negotiation process, their movements create subtle distortions that complicate the strategic calculations of the main participants. When external pressure combines with internal divisions, the path toward a stable agreement becomes more fragile, requiring constant recalibration from U.S. officials attempting to maintain momentum. These external pressures reinforce the idea that any settlement involving Ukraine and Russia will inevitably carry global consequences, pulling in interests far beyond Europe's eastern frontier. In response to these developments, U.S. strategists have been reassessing the structure of the peace framework to ensure that its core principles remain intact even as surrounding conditions evolve. The framework is designed to manage immediate hostilities, define security arrangements, and establish long-term accountability mechanisms. Yet, as the broader environment shifts, Washington must constantly evaluate whether the original assumptions behind the plan remain stable. The shifting diplomatic terrain has led to revised internal projections about timelines, risk exposure, and the likelihood of achieving consensus among all parties. This is particularly important as negotiators prepare for discussions in Geneva, where even minor disagreements can create significant downstream consequences. Reports from Kyiv suggest that internal political pressures are growing more intense as Ukraine's leadership tries to balance domestic expectations with the realities of international diplomacy. High-ranking officials there face enormous pressure from multiple constituencies, military leadership demanding strong defensive guarantees, lawmakers insisting on firm territorial protections, and civilians pushing for relief from the ongoing humanitarian strain. These competing pressures shape the way Ukraine approaches each point of negotiation, often making it difficult for Kyiv to accept proposals that appear, even symbolically, to weaken its long-term position. The complexity of governing through a prolonged conflict is evident in every response, every hesitation, and every public statement emerging from Ukraine's political leadership. Meanwhile, European governments are conducting their own strategic evaluations, wary of a settlement that leaves lingering instability along the continent's eastern borders. Their concerns are rooted in historical patterns. Agreements crafted under pressure often carry hidden vulnerabilities that become clear only after implementation. European officials have repeatedly emphasized the need for a plan that is not only enforceable but resilient, capable of withstanding political shifts in multiple capitals and preventing future flashpoints. These concerns have led to extensive proposed revisions, which now circulate among diplomatic teams preparing for the next round of high-level talks. The revisions cover military limitations, border monitoring mechanisms, economic oversight structures, and post-conflict stabilization measures. Russia's posture remains deliberately opaque. Analysts believe that Moscow is calibrating its responses carefully, avoiding direct commitments while signaling selective openness to ideas that align with its strategic interests. This ambiguity allows Russian negotiators to remain flexible as the talks progress while placing additional pressure on Kyiv and Washington to clarify their positions. U.S. officials recognize this strategy well. It is designed to extract concessions without revealing long-term intentions. This dynamic forces the United States to maintain multiple layers of contingency planning, each one prepared for a different scenario depending on how Russia chooses to navigate the coming negotiations. Adding to the tension are the reports emerging from humanitarian observers, who describe a worsening situation in several frontline regions as winter intensifies. Power shortages, limited medical access, and disrupted supply lines are creating conditions that could influence political decision-making in the weeks ahead. When humanitarian crises deepen, they do not remain confined to the ground, they rise into the political sphere, shaping the narratives and negotiation positions of governments involved. Washington views these developments with urgency, knowing that instability on the humanitarian front can quickly transform into instability on the diplomatic one. Throughout the day, the underlying reality has become increasingly clear. Every actor in this process is operating under immense pressure. Washington seeks stability and strategic balance. Kyiv fights to protect its sovereignty and political survival. Europe fears miscalculation and renewed instability. Moscow maneuvers for advantage. Behind layers of ambiguity, and external powers attempt to influence outcomes from the shadows. The result is a negotiation environment where progress is possible, but every step forward carries weight, risk, and consequences that extend far beyond the immediate conflict zone. The evolving diplomatic atmosphere surrounding the peace discussions continued to shift today as new signals from Washington suggested that internal pressure within the U.S. government is intensifying. Senior officials across multiple agencies have been reevaluating the strategic assumptions guiding the peace framework, focusing on whether the current trajectory still aligns with long-term American security interests. These internal reviews reflect a growing recognition that the geopolitical landscape is moving faster than previously anticipated, and that the window for establishing a durable settlement may be narrowing as conflicting priorities collide and new pressures emerge from several fronts simultaneously. Analysts inside the administration have been studying the political cost of prolonging a negotiation process that remains vulnerable to disruption. They recognize that every delay weakens the collective resolve of international partners and increases the risk that external powers could use the uncertainty to reshape the environment to their advantage. There is also concern that public opinion, both domestically and internationally, may shift if the perception grows that the peace effort is stalling or drifting without tangible progress. These pressures have led to renewed internal discussions about how much flexibility Washington is willing to grant in the coming rounds of talks and what kinds of concessions, if any, could be deemed acceptable without undermining long-term regional stability. On the ground in Ukraine, local officials have reported shifts in civilian movement patterns, with communities near strategic locations preparing for potential contingencies. This behavior reflects years of living in the shadow of conflict, where even minor changes in diplomatic language can trigger deep anxieties. While these movements do not indicate an immediate escalation, they underscore the fragile psychological climate among civilians who are attuned to the smallest signals of political change. This fragility adds pressure on Kyiv's leadership, who must navigate the peace conversations with acute sensitivity to public sentiment while balancing the demands of international partners whose expectations do not always align with domestic realities. European states continue to navigate their own delicate balancing act, torn between the urgency of ending the conflict and the fear of endorsing an agreement that may not withstand long-term geopolitical shifts. Many European leaders have made it clear that they expect security guarantees that extend well beyond the immediate ceasefire period, including long-term oversight mechanisms and a clearly defined structure for monitoring compliance. Their caution reflects a deep awareness of how previous European security crises unfolded swiftly, unexpectedly, and at times facilitated by ambiguous agreements that left room for misinterpretation or exploitation. The current peace framework is therefore being examined under intense scrutiny, with European policymakers insisting that every provision must be resilient against future uncertainty. Meanwhile, Russia's diplomatic tone today remained consistent with recent patterns, measured, calculated, and intentionally vague. Analysts interpret this ambiguity as a way for Moscow to maintain negotiating leverage while assessing the degree of unity within the Western coalition. For Russia, the strength of that coalition matters as much as the details of the framework itself. Any sign of division, hesitation, or internal disagreement among the US, Europe, or Ukraine serves as an opportunity to extract concessions or reshape the terms on which negotiations proceed. This dynamic forces Washington to guard against even subtle expressions of disunity, knowing that the negotiating environment is highly reactive and sensitive to perceived fractures among the involved parties. Amid all these strategic calculations, humanitarian observers continue to warn that winter conditions may exacerbate civilian vulnerabilities across several regions. Reports indicate shortages in essential supplies, disruptions in transportation corridors, and rising risks associated with energy scarcity. These conditions, though not directly tied to diplomatic strategy, shape the moral and political backdrop against which negotiations unfold. Humanitarian strain can influence public sentiment, pressure political leaders, and alter the tone of international conversations. The U.S. has been monitoring these developments closely, recognizing that any deterioration on the humanitarian front could alter the calculus for all parties involved. As the day ends, the reality confronting negotiators is one defined by complexity rather than clarity. Every participant in the process is operating under layers of political pressure, strategic uncertainty, and competing domestic priorities. The United States is pushing for a framework that balances regional stability with geopolitical caution. Ukraine is navigating existential risks and internal pressures that leave little room for error. Europe is seeking guarantees that can protect its eastern flank for decades to come. Russia is maneuvering behind calculated ambiguity, seeking to shape outcomes without revealing its full intentions. And surrounding all of this is a wider international landscape where external actors monitor each development for opportunities to influence the terms of the emerging order. The peace effort remains possible but precarious, a process shaped by ambitions, anxieties, and competing visions of the future. Each new development reveals how closely intertwined these pressures have become and how much weight every decision now carries. The path forward remains open, but its stability depends on whether these competing forces can be aligned, even momentarily, long enough to produce an agreement capable of enduring the uncertainties that lie ahead.